We're at the Walker Art Center for a dialogue with Lucy Walker. I'll be talking to Lucy about her remarkable career as an Oscar-nominated documentary filmmaker and virtual reality artist. Born in the UK and educated at NYU Film School, Lucy Walker has made films on nearly every continent and under the most challenging of circumstances, whether following the Brazilian artist Vic Muniz into the country's largest landfill for the Oscar-nominated Wasteland, climbing the Himalayas alongside a half-dozen blind Tibetan children in Blind Sight, or meeting earthquake survivors living in the shadow of Fukushima in the Oscar-nominated short The Tsunami and the Cherry Blossom. Indeed, wherever she points her camera, Walker's true subject is the human frontier. These are remarkable stories of resilience and rehabilitation, and of individuals, families, and entire populations navigating extraordinary seasons of change. And no matter how seemingly foreign the milieu, Walker achieves the same bracing intimacy with her subjects, so that each new film feels, in a way, like one more chapter in an ever-unfolding magnum opus. Now, with the possibilities of virtual reality storytelling, Walker finds herself at the forefront of yet another new frontier. I'm Scott Foundas, Film Acquisitions and Development Executive with Amazon Studios, and we'll now begin our dialogue with Lucy Walker. I think it's always interesting just to start by talking a little bit about sort of how you came to your chosen profession, because although you did go to film school, you went sort of after having studied other things in other places. And
well, I was actually really young when I started film school still. I was 21. So I was actually the youngest in my class, and took a while to make my first film. And took a while, I think, to figure out what I wanted to say in the world. I feel I took very seriously the responsibility of saying anything in a way, and also of sort of gathering enough craft to say it well.
But it seems like there was always an interest in storytelling of one kind or another, because you had studied theater, literature.
Yeah.
Where do you remember of it, sort of that early interest in storytelling? When did you know that was generally something that was a passion for you?
Oh gosh, I mean, always, you know, and I didn't have, my parents weren't in the creative industries particularly. I didn't know anybody that was. I didn't have any role models for women as directors or filmmakers. I liked watching movies, but I also liked everything else. I liked watching TV. I liked everything. I loved pop music. You know, music and film were probably the most exciting sort of portals into the outside world. Growing up, this was obviously before the internet, but
well, talk a little bit about music in particular, and how you got involved in electronic music and DJing, and through that world, I think, is where you eventually meet Moby, who goes on to do the music for several of your films. Yeah,
I just always absolutely loved music and was a very opinionated teenager about, you know, what was cool music, and I always just had a very sort of strong ear for what I loved musically, and wished I was a better musician or singer, which I wasn't really, but I just was a passionate listener and had a fanzine at one point. And again, never had thought, oh, I could be a musician or I could be a DJ. I just happened to have records, and that was just what I'd spent my money on in England. And then when I went to grad school at New York, I brought my records. I didn't have many possessions in the whole world, but I had some records, and I brought them to New York. And when I got to New York, I was sort of 21, and I'd been very sort of academic and critical. My course as an undergrad at Oxford had been very, I'd done plays and stuff for fun, but there was no creative sort of writing component. And then when I came to NYU, it was sort of the opposite. I remember my first week at film school, they said, well, who do you identify with? And we're looking at the scene, and I thought, well, do we deconstruct the notion of identity in the tradition of Foucault? and then the answer was like the goodie, you know, there was the goodie or the baddie, and I just you know, it was just unfathomably simple, and yet actually quite complicated, because making stuff is, you know, a whole other set of challenges, and that was what I really needed. So I kind of needed to mess around and get my hands dirty and break through all my, you know, creative uptightness that this critical training had sort of left me with, and actually figure out like what I wanted to say and how to say it, and what on earth was going on with myself. And I was lucky when I kind of came to New York. I felt like I found my voice and found a bunch of young artists who were incredibly supportive across, you know, painters, musicians, filmmakers, but a real peer group that really encouraged me to find my own voice. And again, I felt like in England there was this very naysaying, critical, I couldn't be a filmmaker because I wasn't already a filmmaker, sort of catch-22, and certainly I don't think being a female helped. And if I was sort of clever, then I should do something clever, or rather than something creative. I mean, it was just all very uptight and unhelpful. And so I sort of needed to sort of just break all that down and sort of go into sort of beginner's mind and make some bad student films. And it was fantastic, actually, for me, because I got to film school and I was the worst in my class. I was the only person who had not seen a film camera before, let alone made a film. I don't know why they let me in, apart from that I got a Fulbright scholarship. And it was so good for my ego that was just, I had none. There was no possibility of having any, that I just sort of went back to first principles, and I did the undergraduate animation course for fun, because I liked animation, and that was great because it got me a job directing Blue's Clues, and I love animation and have really enjoyed working in that to this day. I did the one course in documentary when that opened up, because why not? I was interested in that too. It turned out to be life-changing. But everyone else was sort of very snobby, because they all thought that you wouldn't eat lunch in this town again if you didn't get the right grade in the right class. And I was clearly just unable to compete at all. And had a really just wonderful time pursuing my own interests. And so one of the things was I had all these records, and so these lovely young people once were in my apartment saying, "You have all these great records, why don't you play them?" I play them all the time. I would play them out, just play them. And it was sort of in the early days of the girl DJ phenomenon. But I wasn't sort of coasting on it. Actually, I sort of had this great summer of my first summer in New York. I was in the projects. Again, you've got to sort of picture this like nerdy, graduate, uptight, critical thinker thinking about, you know, the most Derrida, what would Derrida make of this? And but there I was in this projects in Queens in a heat wave, like learning to beat match with some real deal, you know, New York DJs. And I sort of really learned how to do it properly, and it was great and really, really fun and really, really freeing and really, really just about the love of the music and the love of playing music on these great systems, and learning how to be a proper DJ, which I took great pride in not sort of being the girl. In fact, I probably should have, you know, played. I've always sort of avoided every shortcut and opportunity that's ever been handed to me on a plate, and do it the hard way, but really learn. And that was great, actually. And that sort of, I met some really, really cool musicians, including Moby. And those sort of lifelong friendships have meant that those collaborations are really easy. And then I was even shy to ask him, he's a great friend, but I was very shy to ask him about music for Wasteland, my film. Years later, I was sort of trying to find the right music for that, and assuming that Brazilian music would be the right thing. But one of the things with music is I find that it's sort of what you see is what you get. And I always sort of try different music up against the picture when I'm editing. And sometimes I'm very surprised by what sort of music seems to really work. I would never have dreamt that Aphex Twin, that's very electronic music, would have been so effective with my Amish movie. I assumed it would be acoustic. And the same thing with Moby for the film in Brazil. And somehow it seemed to universalize the story. And I really like that music process. And because I can beat match and mix music and really get very creative around music, I'm not afraid to kind of slice and dice it, and usually I'm able to get these stems, which is the sort of separately recorded tracks, and actually create score music out of source by sort of taking it apart and putting it back together and to fit the picture and to cut the picture to the music as well as cut the music to the picture. And so I sort of find it's actually a really wonderful way to work that's very intuitive for me because of my years DJing bizarre New York City underground parties, which was also a great way, by the way, of earning quite good money. I was always the brokest girl in film school, and DJing was actually wonderful. I used to have, you know, fantastic hourly rate, and as long as I didn't spend it all on records, which was definitely an occupational hazard, I could, you know, it was actually a great little way of earning money. So that's, yeah.
Well, you said that the documentary class at NYU was life-changing. Had you had much exposure to documentary films up until then? And what was it about that class that was so important for you, and you know, sort of leads you to sort of pick that as a path out of this sea of other interests?
Sure. Well, I think that, I mean, it was several things. One is a fantastic teacher, Barbara Koppel, two-time Academy Award-winning legend and female, and terrific teacher who got us to all make a film together in that class. Amazing classmates, including Brett Morgan, just a fantastic peer group. It was a very small group of us, but ridiculously talented like Brett. And we made this film together, and that was nuts and bolts all I needed to know to make my first film in terms of actual specifics of production. But I think more than that actually it was more of a sort of zeitgeisty thing, that I think that the time that I was coming into the industry was the time where the industry was contracting at the same time as a massive amount of people were graduating from film school and entering the industry. And there was this enormous bottleneck, and most of the people I went to film school with have not had any career in film at all, despite being incredibly talented people that could have succeeded in so many other fields that you just have never heard of them. But at that time, what was really exciting and accessible was the new digital video technology, which was changing everything, because you suddenly had these high quality, affordable cameras with affordable media that you could shoot a ton of. And you could blow it up to 35 and it looked like a good movie. And Buena Vista Social Club was a fantastic example of that really got my attention when I saw it on the big screen, and we were on film school and seeing this stuff and thinking, wow, we can shoot it. We can use all our technique from film school. And we went to these fantastic directing workshops in school, you know, with, you know, Spike Lee and Scorsese and wonderful, all these Eastern Bloc emigre teachers, the best of Eastern Europe who'd all fled and were teaching at NYU in Columbia. And so I had my like fantastic directing skills, but we could shoot them on a video camera that even I could afford, the Broker's Girl in New York, although my first film was actually shot on a camera that had to get taken back to Nobody Beats the Whiz every 27 days, I will say that. So it was still piecing it together, but you could shoot this stuff. And then the other revolution at that moment was nonlinear editing. And I think this is really important for documentary, because before, when I learned, I was in the very last people to learn on a Steenbeck and cutting on film, and it was so laborious. But suddenly you could have this fantastically easy computer editing, click, 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 fantastic scene, tweak, 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 maybe even a reshoot, blah-de-blah, special effects. You didn't have to do I mean, I trained animation on like the optical printer. And so I think for nonfiction, those two technological breakthroughs are really driving this incredible period that we have. And that you can make a beautiful, incredible story that's as compelling as a fiction film and as finely crafted and written, but out of the muddy, cruddy, inconclusive mess of real life that's completely confusing and itty-bitty. But if you film enough, think enough, reflect enough, shoot enough, edit enough, you can kind of orchestrate, you know, something that's really fantastically satisfying to watch, is fantastically satisfying as a scripted, acted film, but even perhaps more touching and moving because it is actually real people and real lives and real places. And that's why the documentary class was totally transformational, because I think it gave me the tools to surf this wave that I don't know what else I would have done. Perhaps I would have pursued the children's TV career, because that was my first job. I was directing Blue's Clues, and it went great, and I directed a huge number of episodes, and it was a fantastic experience. But I was twitching to find my own voice and to say something and to observe the world and to sort of make my contribution as an artist and not just sort of perfectly execute the creators of the show's, you know, vision. So that was, by that stage I was kind of ready to, you know, use my voice, I suppose, and I'd gathered enough craft together to, and it's a lot of craft. I think that's one thing maybe to mention, that as so much nonfiction has come out since then, because I was not the only person to notice that, you know, you could now afford these cameras and media and edit, you know, a lot. So of course there's just a massive amount of nonfiction content coming at us.
I think there was something like almost 200 features that qualified for the documentary Oscar this year.
And there's so much more content, all the series and the TV things that don't qualify for the Oscars, and yet there's also much craft. I think a lot of people think that I just sort of rocked up and there was a film about the Amish on a plate, rather than actually that I, you know, studied theatre directing and all kinds of other things for years and years and years, and then directing and as well as cinematography and editing and shooting and, you know, lighting and sound recording, and I really studied for years and improved so many of those sort of skills for years before I even began to make that film, which then took 3 years of immensely hard work. So there's a lot of films. I think sometimes people think because it's real life, you don't need to work so hard. You can just sort of grab it, like you can pluck a fruit that's grown for you or something like that. And it's not not that easy at all in my experience. It's quite a lot of work.
Well, I think it comes back in a way to what you were saying before, that you have this kind of congenital inability to take the easy way with anything, because your first feature, Devil's Playground, about the Amish, is a movie about a community that's famous for not wanting to be filmed or photographed in any way. Your second feature, Blind Sight, is about a group of blind Tibetan children trying to scale a Himalayan peak in the shadow of Mount Everest. And these are people who also have kind of been shunned by their society, their outcasts. The people who are working with them have, you know, a lot of fear about what can happen if something goes wrong in this. So the access issues on these movies are pretty intense. You know, I'm really interested to hear you talk a little bit about, you know, earning the trust of these communities in a way that allowed you the kind of access that you had on both of those first features.
I think first of all, like, why bother is a good question. I think partly my curiosity is also stoked by these hard to access places, right? And I kind of think that maybe, again, in sort of trying to offer something that the world doesn't already have, because I don't want to sort of add to the clutter in the world just for the sake of using my voice. I'd rather sort of add something that people don't have already, don't have access to already, that maybe needs to be said, makes me feel more motivated with all this hard work at hand. And I think the places that people haven't been before make me more, you know, feel like that there'll be an audience if I can find a way in there. And I think for me, it's always been about really earning trust and not sort of thinking about it, sort of tricking trustingness out of people, but actually what it is that they might want and giving it to them, so that it's actually a very straightforward situation. The Amish actually would say that the Amish have a saying about they don't like unequal yokes, is in the sense of like oxen. They're supposed to be yoked together. You don't want a strong one and a weak one. You know, in your wooden yoke situation, when you're doing your Amish agricultural stuff. You know, you want a nice balance, but I kind of feel like that you never want to be unequally yoked, and I feel like when you're making a film with people you're really yoked, it's a really intense relationship, and working, you know, life relationship is an enormous responsibility that I take to the max seriously. I guess I've learned a lot as well just by doing this work about what does motivate people, and why people would share their story, and what they get out of it, and what the risks and rewards for them and those around them are. And I've really been, over and over again, awed by people's human desire to be understood. It feels good to them for their stories to be heard and for their lives to be seen and understood and related to, and that we all benefit from sharing that sort of compassionate understanding of one another. And if I'm doing my job right and I'm able to really get people to open up emotionally, and that's a skill that certain people really have, and my films are as strong as the people are really strong enough to open up, and it's amazing to me that some people are, and sometimes I think the force of the difficulty of the things that people are going through mean that they actually tend to really let go and open up and really let people in, and they kind of know that what they're going through is so difficult that maybe the only consolation that they can find in their difficult situation is helping other people by letting them see what they're going through. And if I've done a good enough job, the audience will get a better understanding of the story and the characters and the world than if they even go there themselves. Because if you can sit there, I can sit here with you and I don't know the most interesting thing about your childhood or your, but if I've done my job right and I was making a film about you, I would find out all the most interesting things, and we'd find the most interesting ways to film them and tell that story, and then the audience would know way better than if they were just sitting there in real life. So that's my sort of job, is to sort of leave no stone unturned, so that there's nothing that you could find out later about a story that I haven't already sort of brought out. And it's never really about earning trust. It's really just about finding that place where everyone wants the same thing, I think, for real, and then just getting it done. Yeah.
So in 2010, you had the novelty of coming to Sundance with two features, as if one isn't hard enough, and two very different films, both included in this retrospective, Countdown to Zero, about the subject of nuclear proliferation and disarmament, and Wasteland, about the artist Vic Muniz. Countdown to Zero, I guess in documentary parlance, one could say it's an issue movie.
Topic film, I call them topic films.
Topic docs. But much as I think you're saying with these, portraits of these cloistered communities, you didn't go in there with a sensationalistic frame of mind, and the movies didn't have that air of being, these kind of, exposés of worlds you would never see otherwise. Your issue documentary plays more like a thriller, or even a how-to manual, how to wreak nuclear devastation on the world. And I'm wondering a little bit about how you sort of came to that form for the film, as opposed to, what we might expect, a more dry, talking heads, earnest movie about the subject of nuclear proliferation.
Gosh, well, that was a real challenge to make that film. And often I think that that's a real misunderstanding that people have, that's very common, that a great topic makes a great movie, and a great story that you can film or that you can put on a screen in a great way, that makes a much better movie than a great topic is a great topic. It is not a good movie. But it is just really challenging as a filmmaker to take a topic and make a sizzling 90-minute film that people are actually going to click on and stream, or get a babysitter and cross town and watch in a movie theater, right? So how do you make that compelling? So I gave it a lot of thought, and we had some world leaders to talk to, which sound really exciting. You're like, oh great, I'm interviewing world leaders, therefore the film must be watchable. But the thing about world leaders is they're on the news every day, and they're actually really boring about what they say, because they're not going to say anything wild and wacky, about nuclear weapons. Particularly, you can, be pretty confident that they're going to say some really safe and on screen, as a filmmaker, completely boring things. And also access, talk about access. I will say I failed on the nuclear weapons access. We were making that film in 2008 and 9. I think, and all our requests for filming are still pending. You'll be pleased to know we have not been turned down. They're still considering all our requests to shoot all these different nuclear facilities. And I'm sure I'll die before we get an answer. But we didn't get access to shoot anything, and I'm just humble. You know, it doesn't matter as a filmmaker, I think, how good you are. You can only, you know, work with the material that you have. So I'm very careful about what you take on, because it's like, if you're making something out of clay or marble or whatever, you don't want to make a tennis ball out of a block of marble. You know, that would not really work. You could spend the rest of your life trying to make your tennis ball out of your block of marble. And there are several filmmakers out there trying to do that. And I feel for them. Doesn't matter how good they are, they're really good, but I wouldn't want that job.
Well, I think as marble tennis balls go, this is not a bad attempt. Let's take a look at a scene from, from Countdown to Zero, part of the how-to portion of the film.
Okay.
Once you've smuggled the highly enriched uranium into the US, you will need a place to build the bomb. The bomb could be built right in the target city. The hard part was what we did in 1945. The hard part is doing it the first time. This is no longer a conceptual challenge. There's no trick. There's no magic that needs to be figured out. It's really just an engineering challenge. It's definitely not rocket science. Rocket science is hard.
You can make a very simple weapon, a so-called gun-type weapon, which was the one used in Hiroshima.
And it was so simple, we didn't even test it before we dropped it. It is essentially just a gun barrel. You have a target, and you have a projectile, and you propel the projectile into the target. You'll need an artillery gun to fire one piece of HEU at the other, which would be bolted onto the muzzle of the gun. The military sells these things as surplus, but they sell them disabled. You would have to make the gun capable of shooting again, and you'd want to test fire the gun to make sure that it fired the projectile at the right speed. This is the only thing that you would need to do off-site.
You would need a group of people, let's say between 15 to 20 to 25, who would be knowledgeable in particular aspects of weapons design, of explosives.
You know, 2 or 3 people to do the machining, 2 or 3 people to work on the gun, 2 or 3 people to work on electronics, people who are experts in ballistics.
People who know something about nuclear physics. You need the machinists and the metallurgists to make your pieces into the right shape and make sure they all fit together.
Ordinary explosives and detonators, maybe some electronic equipment.
You could go online and easily find the lathe for $10,000. You can find the furnace for about $50,000. And you can even find a surplus recoilless rifle, probably also for $10,000.
More than 90% of the effort in the Manhattan Project was making the nuclear material to make the nuclear bomb. If you can get hold of that nuclear material, then it doesn't take a Manhattan Project to make a bomb.
This too can be yours if the price is right. I mean, it's funny to see this now, or more alarming really, because it does feel like it's just out of today's headlines, even though it's from 7 years ago. But I love the mix of animation and interviews and archive just in that brief sequence, and it makes me think a little bit maybe of Errol Morris's work and some other of the people that we think of as being real sort of formal experimenters in the documentary space. Were there, you know, any particular kind of documentary stylists that you felt were kind of guiding lights for you when you started to make your films?
Oh gosh, such a good question. Well, Errol, of course, is so brilliant. I think Hoop Dreams was a massively important film for me. That was something that I looked at a lot when I was making Devil's Playground, my film about the Amish kids. And that mix of verite, but with interviews, but candid interviews, so that you never felt that they were kind of formal sit-down interviews, but you were actually able to get the benefit of just asking people outright what was going on, and having that, but in the context of a really rich scene unfolding. There's a great scene in Hoop Dreams, for example, when the mom is making a cake for her son's 16th birthday, and the scene is obviously this beautiful such a telling and moving scene, and yet she's able to speak directly to camera and share her thoughts. So you think you kind of...
There's a lot of kids around here don't live to see 16.
There you go.
That's when your heart just drops out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that kind of seemed like a great way of kind of having your cake and eating it, for trying to get emotional power, and that was something I did that felt more... you know, I love Frederick Wiseman too, but I loved, you know, also getting in there and barging around, and, you know, I'll say something when we show the crash roll clip, but, you know, I think sometimes you can, you know, knowing what you know, you can, you know, create more opportunities than just, you know, sitting down and letting it all happen. And so I kind of like being more proactive than that, even if everything is true. Sometimes, you know, being more aggressive about where you pick, where you're going, or what you do, or, you know, sort of a thing. I'm not afraid, for example, to say to people, hey, why don't you talk about that thing when we roll camera? Okay, I'm getting out of the way, we're rolling camera, okay. And so that's not, for example, traditional verite, where you just have to wait for them to talk about the weather or whatever. If you're in England, they'll be talking about the weather. No, you know, talk about that other dramatic issue while the camera's here, why don't you, sort of thing. So I'm not afraid to do that, because what they'll talk about is going to be completely genuine, but that's sort of more, again, sort of, you know, this is me perhaps having gone to the opposite extreme after Oxford, of being just very in flow, rather than stepping back to critically analyze Scott, you can analyze my work, I'm just going to keep making it, and not be very, I don't know what you call that, it's not exactly verite, I call it like whatever's interesting, you know, but honoring the truth of the situation, whatever tells the story most effectively, whatever makes the best film most effectively, while of course honoring, you know, the reality of the situation.
The other film from this year of 2010.
And it's funny, they both came out that year, but they were like, and it's funny with because it does, like, they bunch around. I mean, these films take a long time, and so your career looks very sort of. It sort of
that was a busy year for her.
It was not a busy year for me. It was actually the culmination of years of work, and the trains kind of hit the station at once. But the truth was, there had actually been years of work to do both of them. It just so happened that one I did Count to Zero in a sandwich in the middle of making Wasteland. Yeah. So it looked like they both got made quickly, but actually they both took a long time and landed at the same time.
And Wasteland is sort of unique because it is a portrait of another artist. So you're documenting someone who is himself documenting reality through these incredibly creative, large format photographs made out of found materials. And one of the things that comes up in the film is the question of the relationship of the artist to his or her subject, and whether or not that is a mutually beneficial relationship, if it's an exploitative relationship. And this is something you see Vic Muniz talking about a lot with the people around him. And I'm wondering if going through that process of making that film caused you to have any new thoughts or perspectives on your own relationships to your subjects.
I just always have this thing where I love it when the real issues sort of break through what you're supposed to be filming and bubble up, and I kind of think the truth will always get you, and it's great. And as a documentary filmmaker, you love it because it's real, it's drama, it's what you're actually dealing with, and thank God somebody's actually letting it all hang out so you can film it, because if everyone's being very polite and not talking about the actual drama, then it's not very dramatic, and it's not actually very truthful about what's going on. And when it hangs out is when the stuff that's kind of scary for everyone involved. Scary as a documentary filmmaker, observing it. You know, it's like it's worse than sort of your parents arguing. It's your subjects are having a really hard time, and you're like, oh, you have to sort of film that, and it's very nerve-wracking. But it's brilliant because that's what is actually going on, and that's usually when people sort of worked things out ultimately, and why the film was sort of worth watching at all. So I know when I made my film Blindside about climbing Everest, not to spoil it, but we were climbing the mountain next to Everest, and it all was going very badly wrong. But it was everyone started to really disagree about the whole thing. The whole trip was the whole climb. Everything, the tension was becoming terrible, and actually that was what was going on. Everyone was climbing the mountain, like furiously arguing about whether or not they should proceed, because there was so much sort of danger and problems. And yet, you know, when the camera rolled, it's like, great, this is great, you know. And it's not till, you know, things start to kind of go badly wrong and they start to argue, and you're like, oh, thank God, now, you know, this is, the truth will get you, and thank God, because it's actually really interesting. And the same thing with, I felt like with this, it's like, I mean, you just hold on to your hat, and, you know, it's, you know, I never have any nails left, you know, when I'm done filming a good scene. But the best moments you don't provoke, you know, they just erupt, and you happen to be there. You don't happen to be there. If you're doing a good job, you've anticipated exactly when they might erupt, and like a good seismologist, you happen to have the camera rolling when, you know, there's a fantastic scene in the crash reel, which is the clip that many people choose, which you did not choose, where there's a fantastic scene where things really come to a head between the characters. And I knew, you know, I knew pretty well that they might, because I knew who was going to be there that day, and I made sure to get there first and have that camera rolling by the time the one character walked in. And so, you know, it's not really luck, sort of, but you know, you want a story with these, little bit like your bomb recipe, you know, you want the ingredients that are going to make a sort of, you know, dramatic stuff happen. You want a chemical reaction, you want some sort of potassium permanganate or whatever it is going to kind of like go poof in the jar in a kind of compelling way and work some stuff out that's actually really interesting to watch. But and you want to be having the camera roll, you know, so you kind of look for these stories where there are enough strong ingredients that stuff is going to kind of dramatically, naturally rub up against each other and create these, you know, sort of energetic stuff to watch on screen that is drama and stuff that makes a good movie. Yeah, I should shut up. I'm just, you know, but that's the idea, right?
Well, I wanted to take a look at a scene from Wasteland that I think I picked it because it seems to me that often in documentaries and narrative films, the montage sequence can be a real kind of crutch, and it feels like something that got dropped in just to get from point A to point B, and it isn't actually advancing the narrative or conveying any information that we don't already have. And this sequence is so beautifully done, and there's so much going on in it, and it is telling us so much about this artist's process of creation and how he collaborates with his subject. So let's take a look at this scene from Wasteland.
Tenta fazer aqui, ó, vindo daqui até aqui embaixo, sombrear, fazer gradiente, sabe? Bom trabalho, pessoal. O primeiro já foi.
Isso aí não é lixo, isso aí é material reciclado, isso é dinheiro. Muito dinheiro. Caraca, maluco. Tá eu igualzinho. Caramba, cara. Eu nunca imaginei uma obra de arte. Que é isso? Sorvete.
Olha só. Tá vendo?
Ah, isso aí é eu.
É a senhora aqui, ó, com o braço. É essa foto aqui. É essa foto aqui, tá vendo?
Uhum,
a senhora
tô
tá olhando
vendo.
pra lá, o
Tô
braço
vendo, é.
e segurando. E aí é tudo feito do material lá da rampa.
É, tô vendo. Ai, que charme. É, muito bem trabalhado. Deixa eu descer.
Venha, venha, veja.
Olha, meu Deus. Deixa eu ver se eu entendo direito. Peraí. Ah, é. Entendi. Porque o braço... Ah, é. Entendi. É... É tudo material...
We should add that this movie was nominated for the Oscar for Best Feature Documentary, and your short Tsunami and the Cherry Blossom was nominated for the Oscar for Documentary Short. As a filmmaker, you know, especially in the documentary realm, what does it mean, you know, for your work getting out into the world to have that level of recognition? Like, how is it more important in a way in the doc world than it might be in the narrative feature world?
I think it's just really lovely recognition when it happens, and that film meant a lot to me as well because it was something that I'd kind of come up with from the beginning and really struggled with and sort of taken a lot of the learnings of my previous films. So in struggling, and I really had this challenge, you know, it was really, there was no there. The artist Vic was not doing that project before. That was something that we came up with specifically in order to make a film together. And I'd come up with it having spent a lot of time with him in the studio thinking like, how do you make a film about an artist? Because I'd originally been approached to make a film about a slideshow about the history of art. And I hadn't thought that would make a very good film, but I'd liked his work and was excited to meet him and just continue the conversation and sort of ask myself that question, how do you make a film about an artist? And had put a lot of the learnings of my previous films. Actually, I was thinking a lot about how in my previous film, Blindsight, when you have the people setting out to climb the mountain, that watching somebody go through this big ambitious project that may or may not succeed was actually really compelling. And so what if we found an art project that was similarly challenging, sort of the Everest of art projects? And also I'd noticed with the artist that he was wonderful, you know, collaborating with real people or with children or sort of doing these projects with art out in sort of the real world with real people, and that was a really interesting idea. And also that he was very rich living in New York City and had barely been back to Brazil where he'd grown up very poor, but he was at this really interesting moment in midlife, having become very successful, where he was reflecting a lot on his poor roots And actually I persuaded him to go back and do a project in Brazil that really engaged with poor people there. And actually that, again, I knew that would be some rich sort of dramatic material. And I also wanted to go to Brazil, and and I was very interested in garbage. I thought that was a very rich material, and people who recycle for a living. And I thought the juxtaposition of garbage and garbage picking with art and the art world was such a sort of fun one. And I didn't even realize I'd never been to Brazil before. And you can definitely look at all my work as the sort of broke teenager wanting to get, you know, sort of free trips to places I find really interesting, or to interesting worlds I'm curious about and would find it hard to access without the sort of license of a you know, documentary project to really, you know, and a budget to sort of sit there and really just sort of reflect and think and shoot and think and reflect and meet everybody and ask everybody everything and stay there for a while and research and, you know, really get my teeth stuck into something and then follow the whole project through from the very beginning. And that's the trick, I think, with Wasteland as well, is that it's really wonderful to watch a project. At the beginning, we didn't know what was going to happen, and you really film it from the very beginning, and it's not faked, because that was the beginning of the project. And so for me, it was very meaningful that film became, you know, by far, I don't know of any other documentary that's won more awards yet. And I think it's just a really wonderfully received film. And it came at a point in my life where I felt like I'd been working enormously hard, and it had been very challenging. And it was really lovely to have a film that really had come from a lot of the fruit of a lot of very hard work and learning along the way. So it sort of felt like a maturity of my sort of work, and that had really the proof of, you know, that my idea had sort of worked out really beautifully. And so I was really, that was really just incredibly validating. And it came at a time in my life where I was just very exhausted from making those films back to back, and had found it really such an uphill battle to get to that point in my career. And it is just so difficult to come up as a filmmaker. It was for me, just so much of, maybe I just made it really hard for myself, but it had been really hard for years. I almost have this image of myself sort of, that I kind of like, I'm not very good at American football. I haven't grown up in England, so forgive me, but that image of sort of like, I'd collapsed from running, you know, I'd collapsed on the pitch, exhausted, unable to kind of go any further. And I heard this funny noise, you know, and I looked up and the crowd was roaring and the ball had just gotten to the touchdown. I was like, oh wait, you know, and then my career got a lot easier, because it did, having an Academy nomination really made the next films easier to set up, and that was really wonderful. So I could sort of concentrate more on the filmmaking and less on the sort of just the really hard hustle kind of thing.
And one of those films, which we've talked about a little bit earlier in the evening in different ways, is The Crash Reel, which might be my personal favorite of your features. And it is, for people who may not have seen it, a story of the snowboarder Kevin Pierce and his recovery from a traumatic brain injury. And
which doesn't sound like a good film, right? A lot of my films, like, oh, look, an artist in a garbage dump. Great, stick that in my Netflix queue, you know. And like, who's rushing to get that injured snowboarding movie? And it's always like, my films, again, like, I don't make things easy for myself, right? They're tough pitches, like, but when you have to sort of grab people and strap them to a chair and say, I promise it's not what you think when you say it's about an injured snowboarder. It's not at all what you think. It's hopefully a really uniquely powerful story about an amazing character inside a world that turns out to be really quite fascinating. I hope.
And a family that,
yes,
you know, in a way I think anyone can relate to, whether, you know, they have any direct connections to the world in which this film takes place. And I think that, as you say, you know, even when you hear that pitch, you think, oh, okay, it's going to be a triumph over adversity narrative. And in a way, that's like the first half of the film. And then the meat of the movie, in a way, really is about, you know, all of the issues that come up once Kevin has been rehabilitated to the point where at least he thinks he's able to snowboard competitively again.
Yeah.
And that raises this whole raft of bigger issues about parental responsibility, individual responsibility, the world of traumatic brain injuries in other sports, and you know, in a way it becomes another one of these sort of like unexpected issue movies, the way that we say, you know, that Countdown to Zero plays with that form. And of course was really quite remarkable to see at Sundance when it premiered, considering that it was the very place where the story of the movie begins in a way.
I think of it differently. I think of it as a real coming-of-age movie, or about a movie about what happens in life when you can't get what you want in life. Like, what next? You know, and how do you play a hand in life that's not the one you want, and or how do you face reality when it's really impossible to face? And that, so it's interesting. It's not what people think at all.
And of course the title comes from this idea that people who do compete in action sports do have these kind of, you know, quote unquote crash reels that you can watch on YouTube or Instagram or whatever of their spectacular wipeouts. And the film itself is made both from the footage you shot and from a lot of material you sourced, because it is set in a world of people who are kind of obsessive self-documenters, and their cameras rolling at all times, and you had access to this wealth of footage that was made before you'd ever entered into the project. And it kind of raises the question, which I think we were talking about a little bit before we came out here, of in this era that we're in now, where everybody seems to be filming all the time on their cell phone and on their GoPro and so forth, does that in some way change the function of documentary or of the documentary filmmaker? Or you know, would you know, is mere cinema verite no longer as notable as it was when it first came about? Do you feel that the goalposts have moved in some way in terms of you know, what a documentary has to accomplish to have an audience and to be successful in this moment?
Gosh, I think in some ways, like, we're all saturated in content, right? It's not like when I was growing up, like, and your friend had that record, you know, it's just like, remember when you had to go to your friend's house and listen to that one record with a scratch in it, you know? And now it's like we're saturated in access and content, right? And yet, using the example of Crash was a really good one. And not just that, you're right, we had, in addition to the stuff we shot, which is just over half of the movie, we got footage from over 232 separate sources of people that had shot with him, our main character, or had shot stuff that's in the movie. So 232 different places we got footage from, and many of them not traditional archives. And there's so much stuff out there of these kids, including the actual crash that is the sort of instigation of the plot. And yet, what was interesting about the story, to pick up what you said exactly, is that the story might seem to end when he gets back on snow. And indeed, he was being followed by every news outlet. And, you know, as a documentary filmmaker, you can't compete with the news cycle. They film it that day, they stick it on the news that night. You take, you know, 6 months, if you're as fast as I am, which I'm considered pretty fast, to edit the thing. 6 months later, it's not that night on TV. You know, you can't compete with the news cycle. So, for example, with Kevin, everyone was following his story. Everyone followed the story of the day that Kevin got back on the snow. And not one outlet, and I know because I was filming it too, and I filmed him doing his press junkets, not a single journalist asked the obvious question, which was, but are you the same athlete? He'd been at the top of his game, an Olympic hopeful, when he'd crashed, and now he, you know, was very injured, and sort of visibly so. He'd come a long way during rehab, but was he really back on top? And yet every single news story just ran, yay, Kevin's back on snow, yay, you know, good day, great victory, you know, roll that clip and go home. I just was waiting for anybody to ask, like, how are you feeling? Can you actually compete? Or to notice, as my cameras did when they actually followed him down the slope and not just going, yay, at the end, he kept falling over. It was horrifying. I mean, if you were actually looking at footage as I was not following him down the mountain. I was monitoring somebody else, you know, filming him going down the mountain. What I saw was somebody that couldn't snowboard very well anymore, that kept falling over and should absolutely not have been doing that, according to any of his doctors, because according to any of his doctors, if he hits his head again, the injury will be very severe, much more severe than for a first injury. And he kept falling over. And so for me, was the other shoe not going to drop? Was nobody going to ask the obvious question? And like 28 worldwide news outlets, nobody asked a single question. And you thought, wow, that is why documentary film, I think, has this extraordinary place right now in our culture where people really are turning to it. And usually it's well justified. I look around my peers and I think most people are really responsible, making fantastic, high quality, really thoughtful, really accurate, really in-depth, really meaningful work about the world. And when I think about the world as I understand it, I feel so fortunate to be able to have what I feel of as a really confident grasp on a lot of really important things happening in the world through watching documentaries about them. I think about so many of situations in the world. Yeah, that's how I understand the world, is watching my peers make their great documentaries. And I hope I contribute to that real sort of sense of, you know, confidence of doing justice to these complicated topics in the world. And the news didn't, you know, certainly sports news is not, it couldn't have been easier to see that there was a big problem here. And that is not a story that anyone grazed. And then that just blew my mind. Yeah, it hadn't occurred to anyone that there was a more true and more important stuff going on.
Well, I want to take a look at a scene, not the one you talked about earlier that I didn't select, but
a much more interesting scene, actually. Yeah.
But one of the things that I think is so fascinating and disturbing in the film is the way that it talks about brain injuries being very invisible, both to the people who have them, who don't necessarily realize what they've lost and what capabilities they no longer have, but sometimes even to other people in the room, until the moment that they suddenly do become visible. And I think going back to where we started in a way, talking about access, we feel so much in this scene your ability as a filmmaker to be kind of a fly on the wall now with these people. And this is a scene in which your main character, Kevin Pierce, goes to visit another snowboarder, Trevor Rhoda, who has suffered 2 traumatic brain injuries, and this is what ensues.
I'll do a little exercise with you. Okay, Trevor, touch your elbow. Where's your elbow? Can you touch it on your other side? Point to just your elbow.
Elbow?
Yeah, just your elbow.
This one?
Okay. So there's certain things that are a little off. For instance, the other day, Trevor and Peyton, who's Trevor's 12-year-old brother, they all went golfing, and they got a golf cart because, of course, Trevor has a hard time walking. And all of a sudden, snap, no control of impulses, and Trevor ran Peyton over on the golf course.
Directly over?
He knocked, so here's Peyton, here's the golf course, whipped him down and ran over, the entire golf cart was over. And the craziest is that Trevor's facial expression was just like, yeah.
Just like, it was pretty funny. It was classic. Just running over your brother in a golf cart. Just like cruising right over him. These brain injuries are pretty crazy in the sense that, like, it's totally invisible.
Exactly. It is invisible.
Completely.
And the sad thing is I watched that day you went back and snowboarded again, and I wasn't smiling. I was crying because this second injury has not been fun. Kevin, you had a great life before, but you're given a totally different brain. And so you can't go back to who you were before. You have to go with what you have now.
And part of being here, for me, is for you to be able to hear what Tammy's talking about. Right? Because she has the experience, and Trevor does too, that we don't have.
And to this day, Trevor, what do you want to do when
Snowboarding.
Yeah. And where do you want to go?
Utah.
It has not been an easy thing because Trevor, what do you always tell me?
Shut up.
Yeah. I mean, when people are around, he talks, he communicates, but when it's just Trevor and I.
You gotta be nicer to Mom.
No.
Come on. Why not?
I don't know.
No, you should be nice to Mom. I know you're brain injured. I know what it's like to be brain injured. I'm brain injured.
Yep.
It sucks. But you can fix it. You can change. You can work on it. But being mean to them is not helping.
Nope.
It's not funny. I'm not kidding with you. Gotta help them out a little bit. And I know snowboarding's good, man. Snowboarding was awesome when we used to get to do it. But, you know, life's changed and things are different now. And it's the last thing that you ever wanted was to have a brain injury. And you did not want to screw this thing up like we did. Because mine screwed up too, man. But you gotta love it. You gotta realize that things have changed now.
Yep.
You can change this. You can get better. You gotta work hard and love them. Shit's gonna get better. Trust me. You keep working, we'll get better.
Alright.
Got a good life, got a good house, got a good family, got it all, man.
Yep.
It's no easy road to go down to try and get into that brain.
Right.
But I feel
But
like
I do think he was listening to you.
I feel like it could be worth it.
Yeah.
I feel like I could change their lives, and that's been something for me about this. It's like, this has changed my life, and if I can help now change other people's lives, it almost could make it, you know, try and make it feel like it's worth it.
Right.
I just can't imagine, you know, filming and to have really this kind of eureka moment happening in front of you, you know, after 2 years in which this character is saying all he wants to do is to be able to snowboard again. And you really feel that this is finally the moment of realization, you know, and that one moment where he mouths, you know, wow. You know.
Yeah, I think life is really interesting though if you let it and you follow it, and again you find these stories that are really dramatic and you want to know what's going to happen next, and you kind of hang in there. I'll tell you something that's not at all obvious from that scene, but again it's not the sort of pure verite approach, which is that I knew about Trevor, I knew where he lived, and I knew that he lived in southern Michigan, and I knew southern Michigan because I'd done my Amish film on the Indiana-Michigan border. I'd spent months and months and months with Amish kids going to parties along the Indiana-Michigan border, so I knew it really well. And I knew that Kevin was having a speaking arrangement in northern Indiana. And so, again, it's like, is this valid as a documentary filmmaker? I said, oh, you know your friend Trevor is in southern Michigan, and you're going to northern Indiana. I'm going to film you in northern Indiana. Have you thought about visiting Trevor? He's like, yeah, I've always wanted to visit Trevor. And I was like, do you know how close northern Indiana and southern Michigan are? Let's look at it on a map. Maybe how about, since we're filming anyway, we could come film you, you know, paying a visit to Trevor, see how he's doing. And so, again, actually, that was confessedly, you know, something that I had thought of as a scene that would be a way of putting, you know, what's a scene to show where Kevin's at and what is a traumatic brain injury. And I thought that would be an interesting scene to show him with somebody else with the brain injury and see what happened when you put them together. And you have a lot of ideas like that, and not all of them result in such a, I think, kind of compelling scene. But I think that's valid as a documentary filmmaker. I didn't fake anything there. But would he have gone to visit Trevor? Probably not. He probably would have had other experiences that led him to twig, you know, life, you know, will sliding doors take us in similar directions, right? But it's just interesting. You know, you are affecting everything when you're documenting something, and where do you find that line? I kind of take very responsibly, I think, not, you know, faking things, but on the other hand, sort of proposing things or trying to figure out what would the scene be, or what would be what would be on screen, or how do you just sort of film the story? You know, how do you get at what the story is? I think that's something that you can not write that script, because I didn't have anything to do with it, but you can propose a scene if you, and I guess I knew Kevin and his friends and who he talked about, and knew that this guy Trevor was somebody who'd had a second traumatic brain injury and was an example of someone of how bad it can get when you do have that second fall, which was the thing that Kevin is being urged to avoid. So it's just a way of sort of butting those sort of dramatic ingredients up against each other and seeing if they have a chemical reaction, you know.
Before we turn it over to the audience, I'm sure there's questions out there. I just wanted to talk briefly about sort of the latest evolution of your work, which is working in VR,
Yeah.
virtual reality, and people who came in the retrospective to the short film night would have seen one of these pieces, History of Cuban Dance, which I think we're going to see some still images from on the screen here in a second. And people can also, if they haven't seen it, you can watch it online with a certain app and a VR viewing device. And talk a little bit about what has been interesting for you about working in that format, and what you think the possibilities are there in terms of how it may change the way we tell stories cinematically.
I think it's incredible. I think that I got very excited about virtual reality when this sort of current generation of technology sort of happened a few years ago, because, you know, there was suddenly this moment where you could put a headset on and you know, they'd solve the time lag issue, and when you moved around, your brain was fooled, you were really teleported into another place. And if you think about my films as being this sort of wanting to take people and give them this distilled experience, sort of better than actually going there in person, of a world, an inaccessible world, and to take you on a journey to some place you're not actually in, and through a story with a beginning, middle, and end. If you could actually immerse people in it rather than it be a big rectangle, that felt intuitively like a really natural evolution. I got really excited and instantly saw the application. And having come out of theatre and having directed a bunch of theatre when I was younger, thinking in a very sort of site-specific environment with 360 was actually very intuitive for me. I wasn't a kind of screen-only type person. I was already very, you know, sort of a world in which people could look around and choose what to focus on. Also, it's interesting, I think a lot of people look at VR and panic and think the director doesn't have a job anymore. And Stephen Frears, for example, who's a fantastic director I revere, I had the privilege of putting his first VR headset on him at a Cartagena Film Festival, I think. And he said, "Oh my God, my job's over, you know? I can just look where I want." And actually, I'm a contrarian. I disagree with that. I think that actually, you know, even though the rectangle is kind of within your field of view, you're still picking on what to focus. And the human eye actually really only focuses, it's kind of an optical illusion, it's kind of an illusion of the brain to think that you actually can take in the whole screen at once, frankly. You know, you're actually very focused. And even, you know, knowing human brains, you know, or certainly my brain, when I'm looking at the screen doesn't necessarily mean I'm actually looking and taking it in. I might definitely be thinking about the recipe of my dinner or something that somebody had said to me, you know. So, you know, human attention being what it is, I don't think you can take for granted. And I learned directing Blue's Clues that was a fantastically iterative process, and because it was a mixture of live action and animation designed for 3, 4, 5-year-olds, and there was a whole thing about you had to test each question that the host asked the audience on 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, and you really learned that depending on how much stuff was going on the screen, people would be able to give you an answer or they wouldn't. If there was a really fun bird tweeting in the corner of the screen, audiences would miss the information that was on the other side of the screen, for example. And that's just with really simple show designed, optimized for 4-year-olds. So if you take kind of complicated fiction films and documentaries, I pay a lot of attention to what people are actually getting. And I think just because you have this, your head is in a headset and you have this sort of seamless world, it is still finite. And yeah, you don't have eyes in the back of your head, so you have to turn around. You might miss something completely. You're less likely to miss that on a rectangle for sure. If an explosion goes off, you could miss it. On the other hand, as a director, there are still ways of signaling people, steering people around using sound effects or the dog barks or there's different ways where you can direct people's attention around a VR headset as well as you do around, even when you're editing, or sound editing, for example, feature film, it's amazing how you can even, for example, use a subtle sound effect to clue people in to pay attention to something or to mask something that you actually want them to not pay attention to. There's all these sort of subtleties that you can do with people's attention to solve problems, and documentary filmmaking are often really solving problems because you're kind of trying to make this beautiful sort of fantastic fancy ball gown out of a bunch of kind of garbage scraps, So you didn't shoot that scene to make this perfect montage. You shot a bunch of stuff and you're trying to piece it together afterwards. So you're often really crafting and things and having to sort of tweak things and finesse things so that you could really create these finely crafted sequences, and it was not shot that way. So you're constantly problem solving and constantly sort of working to I have to say, I think fiction filmmaking is a lot easier. Give me a script and a bunch of actors and a location you control. It's a lot easier than what we do with documentaries, which is sort of create the illusion that you have that much control and that the story is that compelling, where real life is actually really, really messy, and the characters cut his hair halfway through the scene, and you have to sort of get around that because people don't even think it's him; they think it's his brother. And there's a lot more problems to solve with messy reality than there are with when you've got a whole team of continuity people like straightening the world out for you to make it really seamlessly comprehensible to an audience later. And so I think that the promise of the next generation of virtual reality, which is really exciting, is that it will be much more, you'll be untethered and you can really explore the world. And I just curated TEDx Venice Beach, which was a fantastic, different kind of experience. But one of the talks there was by a brilliant guy, Brooks Brown, who was a survivor of Columbine and was also a wonderful VR sort of wizard, and who's worked a lot with James Cameron and stuff. And he's very excited. He's a real VR evangelist. And I too get very excited by the promise of VR. But I still think for right now, the technology means that, for example, things that are far away get very far away, and it's not quite this whole world you can explore and find your own story. And yet, the director is still choosing elements, and they're still finite, and how your attention goes through those elements is still quite controllable. So they're not as far apart at the moment, but I really am excited by the technology, and it was really fun. This was my first experiment in VR, and it happened to be my first trip to Cuba, when I was just learning that you could really see this incredible incredible country's history reflected in the different dance styles. And I was sort of trying to understand Cuba, Cuban history, and Cuban music. And I realized with this sort of scale from my eyes that you could really see the stories of what the people had been through in these dance moves. And of course, it's so fun to look at Cuba, and it's so fun to look at Cubans dancing, and it's so fun to sort of understand the place through this. This is a very simple piece, but I think it's really, I'm really proud of it. It's really wonderful, and that's the fun of this piece, is there's a lot of Cuba sort of packed into like 5 minutes of hot Cubans dancing.
Now, we should also say that you also went to Cuba to make a sequel documentary to the Buena Vista Social Club, which you mentioned earlier being a film that had meant a lot to you when you were in film school, and that this film did come out in theaters this year, however, not in a version authorized by its own director, and to whatever extent you might want to speak about that. Now seems
it's interesting.
Like a prime opportunity.
Yeah, that's right. No, I made this beautiful film that I was very proud of. That was a follow-up to Wim Wenders's amazing film, Buena Vista Social Club, and it was an amazing experience to make the film, be in Cuba, and to make this whole story. I wasn't aware because I wasn't a producer on the film, but everything looked very legit. But unfortunately, unbeknownst to me and my team, who had an amazing time and made an amazing film, there was a whole very crazy perfect storm going on with lawyers and producers that we were not at all privy to. That is very, very extraordinary. And so we made this beautiful film, but it got unexpectedly pulled by the distributor the night before its world premiere at Sundance this year. And it turned out that I'm allowed to say this because it's true, that the producers had issued competing contracts to various people and didn't have the rights. And it was a really unprecedented, messy situation. And a film came out ultimately that did have my name on it, but that was massively different than the film that my team and I had worked on. And a lot of times, we've talked about this a little bit, but it's funny with a documentary, you know, there's an assumption, and I think it's an important assumption, that when your name is on something as a director of a documentary, it really makes a strong statement that this is your view of this is your view of the story, this is your best understanding of what's happened, and you've poured all your hard work into understanding a situation and distilling it and conveying it. And I have had situations where it's not been quite my cut because, you know, especially earlier in my career, I didn't have final cut, or I worked with producers with different agendas, and it was very difficult sometimes because you feel so responsible to your subjects and unwilling to fake things, and you know, there's a real code of ethics around being a documentary filmmaker, and you can't always earlier in your career, you know, have the control that you need to keep all the elements aligned. And that had, you know, but so there's a few compromises here and there earlier in my career. The thing that actually upset me about the Buena Vista situation ultimately was really that it looks like that was my film, and it wasn't, and in fact I wasn't even shown it, and it was just a very like odd, it was a perfect storm where I had final cut on a Directors Guild of America production where all the legal work looked exactly perfectly right from my amazing, fantastic, top-notch legal team's perspective. It just so happened that there was a whole quagmire, and I think that's where you get into dangerous things, where a documentary looks like a documentary, but it's actually sort of a weird promo for some other parties. And I actually love doing commercials and branded content, and I love doing documentaries, and I just sort of try to be a little bit clear about what the difference is and what's what, you know, because they're different things depending on what you do. And so when I make something that is a documentary that looks like a documentary, you expect that to be my view of events. You don't expect that to be sort of something that the Directors Guild of America was unable to sort of resolve legally, and isn't necessarily my view. It's more like a lawyer's sort of weird thing. So that's sort of like, ultimately that's where I feel like I'm not that, I don't need final cut, etc. But I do think that you have to, I aspire to being really, you know, having that really transparent sort of trusting, you know, being able to, when you do get into that trusting relationship with your subjects and with your audience, that trust is really, you know, the structure of the framework that you're working in is able to really be honored. And that's where it gets sort of icky for me, is where there's some sort of icky stuff happening. So that's sort of, if that makes sense, I think that's something to say about that. But I also console myself that I have to say, yeah, I still feel lucky to have gotten to know Cuba and to have had that experience, just getting to know that incredible culture and the art there, and it's just an incredibly fascinating time. So I can't rue it. I had a great time making the film. It's just a little bit odd not to have that film included in this fantastic retrospective, which would have been so perfect. But thanks for mentioning that.
Questions from the audience for Lucy Walker.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's so inspiring to hear you. I'm becoming slightly disenchanted with academia, so I'm trying to see if I can use filmmaking as some other like the way to channel the narratives and stories of people. And like hopefully next week I'll start my first documentary, which I'm terrified, absolutely. So if you could, like, my first question would be like in general advice. But my other question is, have you ever felt that there were certain stories you could not tell because of your gender or your ethnic background or your class? Like, how did you manage that? And like this issue of privilege, like when you enter the field and you talk to your subjects and you have your camera on your side that intimidates people, like how do you address that like power issue?
Yeah,
I guess.
It's also good questions. My my encouragement is just to start and enjoy yourself and be curious and just make stuff and you know, get feedback and keep going. You know, my first films were terrible, worse than most people's. Yours might be much better than mine were at the beginning, but I just kept learning as much as I could, and I just figured if I kept learning and I kept enjoying learning, and I could still afford to eat, you know, I'd be doing fine, and that's worked out. So I've just only ever trusted, you know, pursuing what I find interesting, and it all makes sense. I'm sitting here now telling you about how my career makes a lot of sense. It made no sense. And even but I said that was the miracle of when I made Wasteland. I was like, oh wait, you mean it's working out? Because until that point in my career, I just felt like I was just failing, and everything was so hard. And finally, everyone's like, how did you do this? You know, and you're like, oh, how do I do this in a good way? You know, it's like, as opposed to, you know, how did you make such a mess of your life and choose the hardest thing ever that you're failing at? You know, that's sort of how it felt like. And so you'll fail and fail and fail until it all makes it look like you were succeeding all along. And then with the power issue, you know, you can certainly say that, and I think that we all need more stories. You know, we need more stories about white people made by black people, for example. You know, whatever. I mean, clearly there's lots of imbalances in the world, right? I've never felt like too many people like me are making, you know, content. You know, and so I've never felt like I should be stopping. In fact, I feel like it's been really hard for me to get this far, and I need to encourage myself because. There's still, I don't think, enough, you know, women's voices out there for sure to feel like we're representing in a healthy way. I have to say, like, your subjects have a lot of power too. It's like, it's not like I'm sitting there thinking I'm so powerful. Half the time you're like, oh my gosh, you feel like sort of, half the time you really feel like, you know, sometimes you really feel like the mom of a very, you know, privileged teenager, and you're sort of, you can follow people around for days and then they'll decide they don't want to film or something like that. Like, you can, you know, they have a lot of power too. It just feels like it's just a working relationship. It doesn't feel like, I don't know, and people give you what they want to give you, and I try to be really mindful of when it does, as the Amish would say, feel like an unequal yoke, and not take things that don't feel appropriate. But I have to say, like, half the time you're sitting there thinking, like, you are really serving them much more than that model of, like, you've got all the power and you're representing them. As I said, I feel on the contrary, you know, I really aspire to give people more than I take with my subjects, and I like to think that subjects for my films have really benefited massively, hopefully, from the experience in their lives in general, in a big way. There might be exceptions to that I'm not thinking of right now, but I think that's generally true. And I really like that. That makes me feel good. One of the things I like the most about Wasteland is not how excited I am about how good the film came out and stuff like that, which is also true. I get very excited and proud about that. But it's actually, I know, I didn't personally expect that idea. I didn't know what was going to happen, but like a lot of good stuff happened to those people who I really cared about because of that idea I had. And as a human being, I think that's actually the best thing that I've ever done. As a human being, not as a filmmaker at all, but in terms of the positive effects of that film and the action. We haven't gotten Impact Awards. I don't get any kudos for this, but if I think about what's happened to the people in the film, they've all bought houses, they've all gone on, they've changed the recycling laws in Brazil. The status of the catadores, those recyclers, you know, has been reported to be really, the stigma has been really massively reduced. Partly it was because of Wasteland, not exactly because of Wasteland, but through a very massively popular telenovela, kind of soap opera, primetime soap opera, that used a storyline that totally ripped off completely Wasteland, that followed a story of a kid who, through no fault of their own, wound up in the garbage dump, sifting through garbage. That story really caught the imagination of Brazilians, and they understood that, oh, that's something that actually it's a kind of wonderful, good, clean job for people who are falling into poverty. It's not prostitution or drugs. It's actually environmental stewardship. And that sort of, that whole class of people got really reframed as kind of like environmental heroes instead of smelly people on the bus you don't want to sit next to. And the lead actor in the film, who's this kid who grew up in that, you know, in a garbage dump, was my date to the Oscars, wound up carrying the Olympic torch for Brazil and becoming the face of Coca-Cola in Brazil and stuff. So, I mean, he's doing amazingly great. And stuff like that. So I think there's just lots of different things, and you know, like there's a school. I mean, there's loads of different fun stuff that happened that's really cool, and I think that's really good stuff. So I don't feel bad about using my power at all. Although there will be people in Brazil that are like, oh yeah, those British American people came and exploited the Brazilians, you know? Personally, I don't think that that's what happened at all. I think it was a really beautiful bunch of stuff that we did together with some other people from around the world, and some really beautiful stuff happened. So go for it.
I think we have over there, sir.
Do you have a general opinion as to what would be the better avenue to pursue distribution for an emerging filmmaker in documentaries?
Gosh, it's a great question, right? Distribution, and it's changing really rapidly. So if I gave you the answer now, it'll be different. You know, next year is just every story is a different story about what's getting out there. You know, Scott's sitting here wonderfully reflecting me in all my glory tonight. Thank you so much, Scott. But Scott happens to also work at Amazon, for example, which is this brand new amazing distribution platform for documentaries. And he can tell you which documentaries people are actually watching on Amazon platform, which is so brand new, right?
I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you.
So gosh, I think that there are, like, I say, like, nobody really knows anything, you know, but you can just look around at like the different case studies of different people trying different experiments and getting their films out there. It is really hard. There's a lot of films out there competing for eyeballs when, you know, there's lots of stuff to do in the world apart from watch documentaries. And yeah, there's so many different ways to get out there. I try not to be a snob about anything. I get really excited if anything means anything to anybody. That's meaningful to me. So whatever, just pursue it all and experiment.
Yes, Sarah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you find funding?
That's a good question. Yeah, very important. It's always a challenge, right, to find money. I feel like I've been lucky since. Again, the Academy Award nominations certainly help, or just not being your first film helps. I found like after my first film was so well received that that opened a lot of doors for grants, and that were very hard for your first film. It keeps changing the landscape. Right now, actually, there's some more money again, because some of the Amazons and Netflixes and Hulus were kind of in a nice moment where I think with those streaming services and documentaries doing quite well, I think relatively on those platforms compared to the theatrical model, that actually people I think there was a record amount of money at Sundance this year, for example, in acquisitions of documentary. And so for me, the funding also always becomes about having had these experiences, trying to find, you know, that sometimes I haven't been optimal in my career in terms of having aligned partners. It's always really important to have the right partners and for everyone to be really aligned, because it is so important that you have that strong foundation of trust. That said, of course, I just had this strange experience with my most recent film, but you sort of can't win them all, and that was a very sort of impossible to predict kind of crazy aberration. But generally, I feel like I've been lucky, and HBO has been a great partner, for example, and it gets easier. I'll say that about financing. I think that funding, I think that that's something that's so hard at the beginning of your career, and did involve a lot of sort of compromise and struggling through. And I think that part hopefully is generally, you know, just pretty smooth and professional, with the odd unexpected, you know, hiccup, which just, I think you just have to think, well, life always, you know, here and there is a curveball. But does that answer that question, I hope?
I think we're almost out of time, but we could take maybe one more here in the center. Yeah.
So as you mentioned, like there are so many different situations in the world. So I'm just wondering, like, how did you decide like which topic you want to shoot, or like where did you get your inspirations?
Great question. And the answer is, it's like Moneyball or something, right? You want to make a good film as a filmmaker that people are going to want to watch. And I always try to think about like what's going to make the best film. And what's going to make the best film is certainly something I'm massively interested in, because it's of all the people who work their butt off for years on these things, really, most of all, it's me. And I also have to sort of get everyone else excited sometimes when it gets really gruesome at 4 in the morning. And so you have to be really intrinsically motivated, super fascinated. If I want a story that I need to know the answer to, I want to drop everything. If I don't go to a party for the next 18 months, then I'll be happy because I'll make this film that I really want to make. So you have to really want to do it. It's funny, you know, for example, the crash reel, I'd always sort of been interested in. I'd wanted to make a film about somebody adjusting to life after a spinal cord injury. I thought that journey of adaptation that people can make to a life-changing injury was a really interesting story to follow. I kind of thought about making that film. I met Kevin randomly. I was mentoring at an event. I was showing actually my film Wasteland to a bunch of action sports athletes when I met him, and was struck by the story and just wanted to see what happened. And something, as I turn something over in my mind, does it get more interesting or less interesting? I'll leave you with this, it's kind of a fun one, called this thing called the Zeigarnik effect, which is sort of this, where your brain just sort of can't stop thinking about something because it's so interesting. It's like a sort of open loop. And that's the Zeigarnik effect. But when something is closed, you kind of forget about it. There's, for example, this, you could use the example of waiters taking orders. You know, they'll remember an order until it's closed. And once it's closed, 10 minutes later, they will have no recollection of what happened. But while it's open, they have to kind of keep it open. And the brain is very, likes those open questions. It will keep whirring away at unsolved things or open things. And so I kind of always think it's like that, unsolved puzzles, stories I need to know the answer to. With the crash reel, it's like action sports. I had this question I couldn't answer. On the one hand, I love looking at those sports. I'm mesmerized. I can't rip my eyeballs away when somebody's doing those amazing stunts. But there's another part of me that thinks, oh my gosh, if they land on their head, they could die. And was it worth it? Or, you know, what would their mom, you know, what would their family experience if that's what happened? And I can't make up my mind about that. You know, I can wear it away from different angles in my brain. And it's a really interesting question. And it only gets more profound when I think about it from different angles, rather than sort of obvious and boring. So that sort of, and sometimes my films, like Canada Zero was not my idea. I got called up by a wonderful participant and they said, are you interested in nuclear weapons? I was like, sort of, you know. I mean, not as a kind of hobby for fun, but yeah, of course it's really interesting and important, you know. So, and it was just their idea, and then I kind of went away and thought, okay, what would be the film I would make about that? Whereas others like Wasteland or Crash Reel were really sort of like all my idea. But on the other hand, it doesn't matter where ideas come from. I'm very excited. Sometimes ideas, my film, we haven't talked about so much about my shorts, but I'm very proud of my shorts too. I always say short is the new long, but I think with these new formats of distribution, like the internet, actually, we're having a golden age of shorts again, and people are really, you know, you can make great things that are short now and different lengths, and I always say that the perfect length for something is 15 seconds short of boring. So, but things could be perfect at much shorter lengths, and for example, my film The Lion's Mouth Opens, which is a fantastic, you know, short I'm very proud of, was the idea of the woman in it. And she said, I'm having these medical tests, and I think if I shared my story, it would be really good. I was very moved and wanted to help, but it wasn't like that was my idea at all. I just wanted to do the best version of it. And so talking about 15 seconds short of boring, we should probably stop before we get boring, right? But it's so nice to be here. It's such a treat.
Lucy Walker, thanks so much.